Welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over consuming a database. So I'm currently in Inhouz Cloud console. To jump into the database hub, all I need to do is click on the databases tab in our menu. So I'm in the database hub. As you can see, I have quite a few databases that are configured. For this video, we're going to be using a MongoDB database, but I'm quickly just going to touch over some SQL and how that looks like. So what we're going to do here is that we are going to write a couple of functions that writes data and read data to a database. And then we are going to consume this using an API. And you could consume it using a function in your web application. You can do whatever you want, but for this demo, we're going to be consuming it using an API. All right. So the database that we're going to be using for the demo is our test MongoDB database. All right. So to consume a database, you need to consume it within some logic. So we're going to jump into the functions of the function hub. We are going to create a function called demo writes db. So this is just a demo to write data into a database. All right, I'm going to create this. I'm just going to give it a workflow name of logic. So like I said before, previously, I was going to just show you quickly what a SQL would look like. So if I were to just look for a MySQL, I can see MySQL operation. I can see the different, I have only one MySQL database, so I can select that database. I can basically use dynamic mode to select my database, where I can basically pass in a variable, right? Some dynamic logic to set the database, or I could just keep it static like it was and just use my test MySQL database. So what we're gonna do here is just give the variable a name, call it response, and then I could put in my query here. I could say get. I'm not really big on SQL. Say from call it product, right? And it would run this SQL in this database, right? Whatever it is. Or I could be that if I wanted to have some more dynamic logic, let's just assume that I had a parameter that was passing in my SQL. Let's call that parameter SQL. Okay. And it's a string, just add it in here. I could just switch to my SQL parameter. And there you have it. I've just passed in my SQL from my function. Or what if I had some parts? Let's say I had maybe collection name. That was the name of the table. Or maybe I'll change this to table name. And this is a string. I could have some dynamic SQL where I say, all right, I use my template strings. I can say select all from, and then I can pass in that parameter dot table name. So you could basically write very complex SQL with dynamic logic. You could pass in your SQL, you could pass in, and this applies to all database transactions, right? Here we're looking at SQL, but it's just the same with, let's just delete this. It's just the same with S3, right? But in this case, it looks very similar. You were just using your puts, your get, your deletes. We have the three functions. You specify the buckets, the key on the body, right? Same thing applies. Let's say we are using Redis. All right, here we have a test Redis account. We do have the different Redis functions, right? And based on the function, let me set a variable. Based on the function, right, the options will differ. And if you are not familiar with Redis, you would just look up the Redis documentation. And we try to keep everything very, very similar because our goal is that developers who already know what they're doing don't have to relearn anything. They could just consume and build your applications. So for this, we're going to be using the MongoDB operation. Like I said, we're going to use our test MongoDB database. I'm going to call this response. Let's call this collection X. Let's just call it random underscore products. All right. So since this is going to be a write operation, we are going to be inserting one. And I am just going to pass that, since we're consuming this from an API, I will pass that from the request body of our API data. So I'm just going to go over here. I'm just going to say this is going to be parameter dot request body. And I'm just going to put this in an object that's, let's say, product. All right. And then the next step will be to return. We're going to return the response. All right. Just keep in mind, when you're using parameters, you have to provide the prefix, and the same applies to variables. And you can watch the function tutorials to understand how functions work. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to save this, and we are going to deploy. Okay. Now that we have deployed, I'm going to switch over to Inhouz API. We're going to create a new one. We're going to call this API test DB. All right. We're going to say this API has been created to test database. All right. We're going to give it a sub URL path of test DB. And we're going to expose it to the public. I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to go to the endpoints, and I'm going to call this slug add product. And this is going to be a post request. Okay. So now I have my 3 environments configured. So test db-inhouse HQ, which is basically my subdomain for my account. Dev indicates the development environment, test indicates the test environment, and nothing in the production environment. So this is a post request. I am going to select my demo writes db function. All right, so that's that. And that's it. I'm not going to add any more configuration. I'm going to go ahead and save this and deploy the current version to the development environment. As you can see, I have nothing deployed. I'm just going to go ahead and deploy it to my dev environment. I am going to just copy this URL, open up Postman. So this is a post request. I'm going to paste that in there. Prefix this real quick with HTTPS. Okay, and then our body, we are going to use JSON. And we are going to provide a product. The beauty about MongoDB is that I don't have to have like a proper schema. I could just put whatever I want here. So I'm going to say name is Jordan 1 Lowe's. I'm going to say price is $140. I'm just going to say 140. Maybe that's a number, right? I'm going to say currency is USD. I can say description. I say Nike Jordan 1 Lowe's black and red. All right, so that's it. So we're going to go ahead and post. And we didn't configure any authorization because this API endpoints is exposed to the public. All right, so as you can see, this was successful. You can see our ID, which indicates that this was inserted into the database and it's now a database record. So the next thing we're going to do is to write another function and another API to read from our database. So I'm going to jump back into, so I have this API, this testDB API on this page. I'm just going to leave it open here. I'm going to hop back on this tab and jump back into the functions. And I will say, let us read DB. Okay. So I'm going to create another one that just says demo read DB. Okay. And here we're just going to say demo to read data from a database. It's going to give the workflow another name, just like the name of logic. We're going to pick MongoDB operation. We're going to select our test Mongo database. We're going to give the variable a name of response. I forget what we called it before. I think we called it, let's just see if I can find it really quickly. Switch to read, we called it random products. Let's copy that. Go back here. We're just going to use the find. In this one, I'm just going to find everything. I could put a query if I wanted to. Let me leave that option open. All right. So I am just going to pass in a query. So I'm just going to code it here. I'm just going to say parameter dot request body. This is going to be an API, consumed in an API. So we have a system generated parameter called request body that works in APIs. So we're going to say dot query. All right. And we are not going to skip or limit or sort or do any of the cool stuff that MongoDB can do. All right. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to return the response. You know, the last time I returned it in by itself. In this one, let's do something else. Let us return it in an object. So we're just going to call this results, or maybe we call it products. Let's just call it results. All right. And then we call this response. So variable dot response. Okay. So basically we're returning some JSON. We're going to save this and we're going to deploy this function. So now we have version 3 deployed. I'm going to jump back into our API. I'm going to add another endpoint. We're going to call this endpoint get products. So it's going to be another post request. When we jump into the get products, all I need to do is just select my demo read DB, select that function. That's it. Save and deploy. So now my active version is 3. My deployed version is 2. I'm going to deploy it to dev. Now the deploy version is 3 as well. I'm going to copy this read endpoint. reopen Postman. So post request, HTTPS. So the system will redirect your calls if it's not HTTPS, but just trying to create good habits here. Just make sure it's prefixed. So our data here is JSON. Okay. So let's say JSON. And I think we called it query. So let's say query. So let's do this with an empty object. And we can see that we get our Jordans. If we go back over here and we change this to, let's say, LeBron's, and let's call this, 125 US dollars. We call this Nike LeBron 20s, 20 yellow and gold. I'll call it blue and gold. All right, so I'm gonna send this, and now it's gonna store into our database. And if I were to come back over here to our get and query, we can see that we have two records, where we have our Jordans and we have our LeBrons. So if I was to pass in a query, this is just a straightforward MongoDB query. If I were to put an underscore ID and put in one of our IDs to get the LeBrons, it returns just the LeBrons. All right, so in this video, we were able to consume a database using functions. We basically connected our functions to an API. You can connect this, you can consume your functions from web applications, from APIs, within automations. We have a lot of tutorial videos. Please watch and learn how to use different modules. You can even consume your databases within like Inhouz Sign and various in-house payment modules as well. All right, so we've gone over how to consume databases. We know that we write our database logic within functions, and then those functions are consumed within web applications, APIs, automations, and all the modules on the Inhouz Cloud platform. And we've demoed how this is done using APIs. All right, that's it for this video. See you in the next one.